Thank you, and I will immediately go for solutions and opportunities in the industrial development in the energy sector. And the prediction how these opportunities would occur were made early, and one of the earlier descriptions of how this would come about was from my former colleague Claude Werner, who published this book on by OECD in the year 2000. And what it shows in this diagram is how industrial experience already during the 20th century had brought down the cost of solar and wind electricity generation. It's called experience curves because if you draw it in a linear diagram, then it becomes curves, but if you draw it in a logarithmic diagram, it becomes straight lines, and straight lines have the almost inevitable tendency that you want to extrapolate them. You believe they will continue to be straight lines. And indeed, in this case, it has proven to be justified. He argued here with this diagram and engineering arguments that solar and wind, if they were just subsidized for a few years when they were still more expensive than conventional thermal power, they would become cheaper than thermal power in the end. And indeed, some countries did subsidize solar and wind during this century, and we can see here the dramatic growth in solar installed capacity globally. And the year that I see as the year of the turnaround, the revolutionary year in the energy industry, was the year 2016. Here we see the first record low prices offered for solar electricity, below 3 cents per kilowatt hour in Dubai, and just a couple of months later below 2.5 cents, and then in Mexico, now we're in 2017, below 2 cents, and then below 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and the most recent from 2021 in Saudi Arabia. Solar electricity was offered at about 1 cent US or euro cent per kilowatt hour, and that is very low. I will illustrate later how low it is. And we see that this is advantageous for Southern Europe, where solar resources are readily available, and we see progress going on year by year now, and April this year was, as you see here, a year when solar and wind was producing a lot of electricity in Southern Europe, helping to reduce the impact of the gas price crisis in Europe. Global wind power capacity, likewise, has increased significantly in recent years because some countries did subsidize it initially. But now, just as solar, these are installed without subsidies, and again, the year of the revolution was 2016. Sorry if you missed it, but now you know where to look. 2016. In Morocco, a procurement was given the result where wind power onshore was offered between 2.5 and 3 cents per kilowatt hour, or $25 to $30 per megawatt hour. And in 2017, Enel won a bidding process in Mexico at a price of below $18 per megawatt hour. Again, extremely low compared to thermal power from new plants anywhere in the world. Offshore wind, which has always been described as something where you have an enormous potential but very high costs, also had a turning point in 2016. In the Netherlands, a competitive bidding process was won by Danish Dong Energy, now Ørsted, who offered to provide electricity from offshore wind at about 70 euros per megawatt hour. Still expensive. This was in the middle of the summer. Not much happened in August. But in September, there was a procurement of the Danish west coast, won by Vattenfall with a bid of 60 euros per megawatt hour, 10 euros less 2 months later. Nothing happened in October, but in November, Vattenfall won the tender for Danish Kriegers Flak on the east coast of Denmark with a price below 50 euros per megawatt hour. If you draw this in a diagram, you also get a linear relationship. Decrease with 5 euros per month and megawatt hour. In this case, if you did extrapolate that, offshore wind power would have been for free by the summer of 2017. Didn't work that way. Linear extrapolation, not correct in this case. But what did happen was that in the spring of 2017, we saw the first bidding processes that resulted in companies offering to build offshore wind power and supply it to the spot market without any subsidies. And in Northern Europe, that meant something in the order of 30-35 euros per megawatt hour. Dong and Energie Baden-Württemberg was the first who won competitions like this in Germany. And a little later, Vattenfall won a Dutch bidding process, also not providing any subsidies, just allowing Vattenfall to use a certain area offshore and being connected to the grid. This has already shown that these sources of electricity are now available without subsidies to compete with thermal power plants. But what is even more important is the relationship between these costs of renewable electricity and the price of fossil fuels themselves. This relationship is somewhat hidden by the fact that the world market price of oil is given in dollars per barrel, not in dollars per megawatt hour. You don't have to be a professor to calculate the relationship. Maybe it helps, and this diagram certainly helps, because here you can see the relationship. And if we look at today's price of oil of about $109 per barrel, it's the equivalent of almost $70 per megawatt hour. And remember, we just heard that solar and wind was now available at prices as low as $10 per megawatt hour, or maybe up to 30 if you calculate the least favorable plants in Europe. So renewable electricity is available at total costs lower than the cost of the energy content of oil. Even worse is to calculate or transform the market price for methane or natural gas, often given in dollars per million British thermal units. Again, you don't have to be a professor to do that calculation, but it may help. A few years ago, the price in Europe was roughly $7 per million British thermal units. And now, during the gas crisis, already that was such that the best solar and wind plants were below it. But since then, with the gas price crisis we now have, the gas price is off scale compared to the diagram I made a couple of years ago. And renewable electricity is certainly cheaper per unit energy than the price of natural gas. Coal, which is the cheapest fossil fuel, traditionally was also even cheaper than the cheapest solar and wind power. You needed a carbon price to justify replacing coal directly per unit energy with renewable electricity, even though renewable electricity could outcompete coal-fired electricity generation. It was difficult to substitute coal in other industries without considering a carbon price above the coal price itself. But again, the situation now is such that renewable electricity is significantly cheaper per unit energy than coal also. So even without the current crisis, renewable electricity could compete with these fossil fuels. Now, with the fuel price crisis in Europe, this is a wonderful economic opportunity. So what we have seen in the years since the revolution in 2016 is that renewable electricity has started to replace oil in some sectors, especially in the transport sector, where some countries are now way ahead of most of us. Norway, for example, approximately 85% of all new sold cars are plug-in cars. Shenzhen in China has 100% electric buses. It's about 20,000 buses now in Shenzhen that are battery electric. In Norway, we can see battery electric ferries now available in other markets as well. Even quite large car ferries are now battery electric between Sweden and Denmark. And even airplanes can be battery electric. I did claim in a presentation some 10-15 years ago that that would never happen. but there was a very nice young man in the audience. He didn't say anything, but he came up afterwards with a little piece of paper and said, check this website. And that was the website of a Chinese company already 15 years ago offering a two-seater aircraft, battery electric, with a range of about 2 hours flights. Now in 2015 already Airbus offered a two-seater trainer aircraft, and now a company that I have done my best to support in Sweden is developing a 19-seat electric aircraft with a range of about 500 kilometers. And they have managed to sell these airplanes even before they have designed them, with good arguments on how competitive they will be. But it's not only in the transport sector, it's also in industry. And one of the pioneering efforts here is to avoid carbon emissions when producing steel. There are two competing companies in Sweden now developing such processes, and the first one is Hybrid, which is a collaboration between a steel making company, a mining company, and the power company Vattenfall in Sweden. In June last year, they produced the first sponge iron using direct reduction with hydrogen produced from electricity, replacing coal, or coke, which is a normal reduction resource used in this process. 2 months later, SSAB had produced the first steel from this sponge iron, and another 2 months later, Volvo had produced the first vehicle using this steel. And the rationality in the car industry transforming in this way is that once you have made vehicles electric, running on renewable electricity, the carbon dioxide emissions from the steel in the vehicle is the major source of greenhouse gas emission from a life cycle perspective. And they are often willing even to pay a bit extra to get steel produced without any fossil fuels. So what we are enjoying is a situation where what has previously been described as something necessary to save the world, make it possible to avoid the risk of unmanageable rapid climate change, has now become profitable. It did start in 2016. Again, sorry if you missed it. We are not that fast in noticing these dramatic changes, but now this is a global opportunity, and it has become an even more wonderful opportunity with the fossil fuel price crisis occurring because of the geopolitical events in the last few months. So this is not only an area of challenges, it's an area with wonderful opportunities for those who see what is happening and have the engineering skills to utilize the opportunities. Thank you.